You're listening to the Talent Therapy Podcast. Here, you'll find discussions around recruiting trends and best practices with talent acquisition leaders in the biotechnology and pharmaceutical industries so that you and your team are informed and up to date in an ever-evolving space. And now, here's your host, Chris Tamburini.
All right, Miss Angela Justice, welcome to the Talent Therapy Podcast. How are you this morning?
Thank you, Chris. I'm doing great and thrilled to be here with you. Thanks for inviting me.
Of course. I've been excited about this conversation for the last probably month or so when you and I started talking about having it. You have a great background. You have a unique background in the talent and the people space. And I would love for you, Angela, to tell the audience really how you got into the people and the talent space, what your journey was like, and kind of how you ended up where you are now. And I think the audience is going to specifically like this one because it is a little different.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I really consider myself incredibly lucky that I got into the people and culture HR space because it wasn't a career path that I had envisioned at all. Frankly, I really didn't know a lot about it. When I started my career, I really thought I was going to be a scientist or an academic. I got my PhD in biopsychology and really loved research, loved science, loved all of that. However, I quickly realized while getting my PhD that perhaps academics wasn't really the right path for me, and I wanted to get into business. So I went to McKinsey where I was a management consultant and learned the fundamentals of business, how to think about strategy and operations. And really it was there where I had my first kind of glimmer about the, people HR function, because I realized that, you can design the best strategy in the world. You can be incredibly thoughtful and innovative and really come up with something that has the potential to do incredible work. But if you don't have the right people, if you don't have the right processes to motivate and incent and reward behavior, that strategy is likely going to fall a bit short. So that was kind of the first glimpse of the importance of talent as a function, right? As talent management, as a practice. But still, I didn't quite get into the HR space yet. It took a few different moves to finally make my way here. But again, thrilled that I did.
So looking at your background, you actually spent a lot of time in medical affairs, right?
Yeah.
And then you ultimately combined that, and also looks like you were kind of working in a hybrid between medical affairs and also in people and talent. And that is a really unique situation. I'm curious to hear, and I think the audience would be curious to hear about that and how you combined those two disciplines, which are traditionally very different and very segmented. They're separated, right?
Yeah, it's a pretty unique paths, right? So as I mentioned, I was a management consultant for a time. From there, I went to work for one of my clients, which was a patient advocacy organization, the National MS Society. And when I was there, I got a chance to actually operationalize the strategy that I had designed with the board of directors at the National MS Society while I was at McKinsey. So put a lot of the learnings of McKinsey into practice. And part of the work at the National MS Society was working with the neurologists in the field and the scientists, but also working with biotech companies. And, ultimately I moved into one of those biotech organizations in the medical affairs function. And the bridge there was I was working with neurologists for the NMSS. I was working with neurologists for the biotech company. And that was really my first entree into medical affairs. And from there, I spent a lot of time in medical affairs. It was really the kind of the career path that I had chosen.
Yeah.
Again, the kind of fortuitous leaps that took me to HR, kind of happened because of that. But my time in medical affairs really was the foundation, I would say, for what has ultimately led to some of my success in the people function. And that I'm able to combine the two. And in my most recent role, I was the chief people officer, but also head of medical affairs for TCR Squared Therapeutics. You're right, functions that don't typically go together. And I don't think they really ever will, right? Like that isn't normal. It was really a role that I kind of created because I had experience at that point in both the medical affairs function and the HR function. And there was a need, right? We had a need at TCR Squared to build out a medical affairs organization because I had spent a lot of time in medical affairs and I really understand the space. I volunteered. I said, look, I can build this, I can do this. And was able to bring in an incredible vice president to lead the medical affairs practice. As you know, I have had an incredible vice president of HR in Liz Vigent leading the HR function at TCR Squared. So I was able to kind of seamlessly combine the two and lead both functions. Again, simply because I had at that point quite a bit of experience running both of those areas.
As you're saying this, I'm thinking, she had to do some convincing and some selling to let somebody at TCR Squared, I'm guessing probably the CEO or the board, say, yeah, she can lead both medical affairs and the people functions. Because I think most companies or most boards would say, what do those have to do with each other? And how can we have one person leading two highly separate functions? So you volunteered, and that's a nice thing, right? I think a lot of people volunteer, and some people are like, well, I appreciate the openness to impact your organization, but we need to keep these functions totally separate. How did that? I'm curious how that conversation
Yeah.
ensued. Like, what happened? How did you convince the board or the CEO to say, yeah, you can lead both of those functions, even though they typically are very separated?
Yeah. It's a really great point, right? Saying I volunteered is kind of glossing over the whole like the deeper story there. So, but it really wasn't particularly a lot of convincing. So it came up. We were at a board offsite. So we were at a strategic board offsite. Um, this was, a while back, but we
Yeah.
were talking about what was next for TCR Squared and what was needed as we think about the growth of the organization and where we were from a commercialization or drug development perspective. And, it became pretty clear to me that medical affairs could be a really valuable function, a very valuable kind of skill set to add into the organization because we needed to get word out about our platform and about our science and about the potential that we had for really bringing life-saving therapies to patients with cancer. And so we started talking about what that would look like at that board retreat. And, thankfully, I had a great relationship and partnership with the board. The entire executive team did. It was an incredible collaboration between the board of directors and executive management. And one of the board directors in particular had a great deal of experience with medical affairs. And she was like, you know what, look, you're right. We definitely need this. Now is the time. So I went back to my room that afternoon. I drafted a job description. I went through it with that board member, presented it to the board, got approval. I wasn't necessarily thinking about leading it at that time, but it was, I think, pretty apparent, at least to them, and then ultimately to me, that it made sense. Again, because I had done medical affairs for so much of my career, and knowing that I could hire an incredible leader to handle the day to day and really drive the strategy and continue to evolve it. It seemed like a really natural fit. So, yeah, I would say it didn't take a lot of convincing because there was already that great partnership and trust and collaboration between the board, the management team, and the organization.
Well, I think that speaks volumes to the level of collaboration that was happening there. Um, you don't necessarily hear that level of flexibility or openness in other situations. So that's a positive thing.
Yeah, for sure. And and I think the other thing it really speaks to, and this is something hopefully that will resonate with your listeners, is advocating for what you think is important for your company, and being willing to kind of go out on a limb and say, look, I could do this, or I think you need this, and I'm happy to help. And if it leads to a kind of crazy hybrid career title like I had,
Yeah.
great. If not, regardless, you've put yourself out there and you've shown that you can think creatively about how to deliver value to organizations. So I think there's just a real value in thinking a bit differently about what a career can look like, what a job can look like, and value that one can offer to an organization.
Yeah, that's a topic that's actually come up quite a bit in these conversations, and that topic resonates with me. Right, is the ability to be versatile and adaptable and advocate for yourself. I think that in business, a lot of the times, not just biotech, but in business, people tend to be put in a box, and they say, "Okay, well, you've studied this or you've practiced this. We're going to keep you in this one area." And I feel that the people that have the most fun in their careers and who challenge themselves the most are the ones like yourself who are willing to take a little bit of a risk and be versatile and keep things open minded and come to the table with these creative solutions. And sometimes those creative solutions might not really be productive and they'll get shot down, but at least you're thinking about them. And the fact that you were able to take this, your background or backgrounds, and come up with a creative solution and then have that solution be bought into by the executive leadership team and the boards is cool. And I think that's something that a lot of people in general who listen to this or that maybe you have conversations with, they could take that advice and do interesting things with their career that not maybe they thought they couldn't do.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And it's so interesting, right? Because you often hear about career ladders or career paths and you think of them as linear, right? You
Yeah.
think this leads to this, leads to this, leads to this, and if I just do, this whatever, you're gonna, it's a linear path. But in reality, I don't think that's the case anymore. And frankly, it doesn't have to be the case anymore because the world of work, companies, everything that's going on is changing so quickly, and to be able to think a bit more broadly, a bit more innovatively about how to have an impact in an organization, how to maybe combine some areas of focus that don't typically go together but could, that leads to some pretty interesting work. And so I encourage people to think a bit more differently, just think differently about their work and their career and their roles, and how to perhaps blend areas of interest and passion and impact differently. Because I think there's a whole host of opportunities that present themselves when you start thinking a bit more expansively about your career.
Yeah, most definitely. Um, I guess that kind of leads us to another topic that I think you and I wanted to cover. And it's really about your career and how you approach um, learning and development and career development and how that has helped you throughout your career. So I'm curious to just kind of get your general overall thoughts on learning development and coaching and career development and just your overall focus on it and approach to it.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Yeah, look, I think for me personally, one of the most important things is learning. I'm deeply curious. I'm always reading something, learning something new. I really love looking at a new area or challenge and just trying to figure it out and learn as much as I can. So learning has always been just kind of core and fundamental to who I am and where I derive satisfaction. And I had the privilege of leading learning and development at Biogen. I was their chief learning officer, which is a role it was actually the inflection point between medical affairs and HR. So I was leading initially the medical training organization for Biogen and had the opportunity to then lead all of learning for Biogen and really turn that into a competitive advantage for the company. And being able to lead the learning and development organization gave me the opportunity to think a lot about learning and the value of learning and development, and how people learn and how people navigate their careers. And so, having the opportunity to do that professionally when it was something that was so deeply interesting to me personally was quite a privilege. And it gave me an opportunity to think about how people build their careers, right? And how people can make learning that force that propels them from one thing to the next, and thinking about being really goal directed in one's career. So let me just pause there and ask you. That's kind of what you were getting at. If there's any, what else you would like me to address there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that in the learning and development, space, it's a big piece of organizations. And I thank you for kind of going over your general approach and experience and how you got there. One of the things that I think you and I kind of talked about before this is be the buyer, not the seller. And so
Mm.
I wanted to kind of dive into that concept in your mind and see what you meant by that, because it's actually intriguing to me, and maybe you can expand upon that a little bit more.
Yeah, that's one of the things I say to people a lot, right? When I'm coaching people, employees, clients, whomever. But a lot of people, I think, approach their career. Let's even say like they're applying for a new role or thinking about a new role, and they approach the entire process as the seller, right? They want
Okay.
to sell themselves. They want to
Yeah.
get that next job. They want to get that experience. And I really like to think of it a little bit differently. I encourage people to think more as the buyer. So to be really intentional about what it is you're going after and to be as much in the evaluator seat, perhaps, as that interviewer is who's interviewing you. So, for example, if you're thinking about what you want your career to look like, I always ask people, like, not what's your next job, right? Not what's your next job, but what's the third job from now? What's that next job that you want? And what skills and experiences do you need, and connections perhaps do you need to ultimately get there? And so then to be really intentional about how you're building your career, building yourself towards that ultimate goal by selecting companies and opportunities that are going to give you the skills, experiences, and connections that you need to get where you want to be. And there's obviously a bit of opportunisticness that
Of
can feed
course.
into that as well. But to really think about it as going out shopping for your career, for the experiences that are going to get you where you want to be, I think that puts people in an entirely different mindset, a much more empowered mindset, and a mindset where they feel way more in control. And then that's also one, coincidentally, where they're going to shine and their confidence is going to come through, and they're ultimately going to make better decisions, and the companies that they're interviewing with are also likely going to make better decisions. So yeah, people quote that back to me all the time, be a buyer, not the seller. I probably say it a lot because I hear it
Yeah.
coming back to me a lot.
Yeah. One thing I've noticed in my my years of recruiting and talent acquisition is that you're onto something, right? Like the candidates who are very confident in what they want and what they don't want, and they've intentionally thought about what they want and what they don't want, are typically some of the most sought after candidates, because they have clear goals, they have confidence in what they're good at and what they're not good at, or what they want to be good at, and they're not, like you said, overly selling themselves into a particular area that maybe they don't aren't qualified for, or maybe they maybe don't belong in because of their qualifications. Um, and so, yeah, I think that's a really, really interesting approach on how to look at things from a career perspective. But it also makes sense. I mean, as you're talking, I'm like, yeah, I totally understand what she's saying. That a lot of the best people I've worked with have been intentional around that particular aspect, and they're not overly promoting themselves, but they
Mhm.
are being very selective in
Mhm.
what they do and what they don't do. And yeah, it's a good way to look at things. And clearly,
Yeah.
yeah,
And look, obviously, people in an interview situation still need to do their best to represent their experience, their credentials, what they uniquely bring to the organization. There's a little bit, I don't want to say of sell that has to go in, but certainly somebody has to want the role and be prepared to explain why. But I think when you approach it that way, it shifts the dynamic, even just in that, even in a single conversation with an interviewer and a candidate. If the candidate has the perspective that they're going in as the buyer, not the seller, I think it just brings a whole new level of authenticity to the conversation, and I think it leads to an easier time for both parties to assess whether or not there's a fit. There's just that kind of honesty, transparency, directness from the beginning that sets the entire thing up for a greater, higher level of success.
I agree. I feel like sometimes the best way to sell or promote yourself is to be very transparent
Yeah.
and talk about the things that you need to work on or that you're not necessarily skilled at, because it shows level of
Yeah.
and authenticity. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Which actually kind of leads me to my next point is about, don't pay attention to things like title as much as you're paying attention to things like skills and experiences. Um, what's your take on that?
Oh, I completely agree. And, when I think about my own career path, I've gone all over the place when it comes to titles and levels. For me, it's really never been about the title. It's never been about a linear progression. It's been about gathering skills and experiences and connections and making an impact, right, in the various roles I'm in. So, if you think about my career, I start after I was a management consultant, my first job after that, I started as a vice president at the National Multiple Sclerosis Society, was quickly promoted to executive vice president. And then my next role was as a medical science liaison, which is it's a completely, looks like a huge demotion, right, in terms of level, if you were thinking about it from title alone.
Yeah.
But I didn't care because I wanted the experience of working at a biotech company. I wanted to get that field based experience. And for me, it was an incredibly powerful move. I learned so much and I had so many doors open as a result of taking that role. But if I would have been thinking about title and I would have held myself to this, a need to advance, quote unquote, um, it would have been hard to take that role. So yeah, I encourage people to think about what the job is, what the work is, what you're going to get from that work, and really not focus at all. Honestly, I don't see a huge need to focus at all on title.
So you just brought up a conversation or a topic rather that I have conversations about from time to time. And that's when people make a shift mid-career, right? They go from one discipline to another because they get tired or they feel siloed and they want to completely shift fields. And I
Mm-hmm.
won't say you completely shift fields, but talking about that move you just made, it was certainly a pivot,
Mm-hmm.
right?
It
From
was
a
a pivot. There was
Yeah,
a clear bridge, right? So I think that's the other thing that's important is, and very much has been true for me. So in every career move that I've made, there's been a clear and obvious bridge. So from the National MS, or from, let's back up, from McKinsey to the National MS Society, it was the board of directors, the client relationship that I was working with. From the National MS Society to what was EMD Serono, was the first biotech I went to, it was the neurologist that I was working with in the field of multiple sclerosis. So it was the therapeutic area, MS, and it was the people, the neurologists, the scientists, and the patient advocates of the NMSS that were really that bridge. From EMD Serono to Biogen, it was the therapeutic area, the people, it was just, you see the connections, right? They continue to
yeah,
bridge. And similarly, when I went from medical affairs to learning, it was, at Biogen doing the learning stuff from medical training, building it into learning overall, and then learning to HR. So there's always been a bridge. I think there always has to be a common thread. It makes it easier to do that pivot than something that's like completely on other sides. But, I think you can be thoughtful in how you craft and architect those bridges.
yeah. That's a really great piece of information, and it's so logical, right? Like to make a totally random move into something different is very difficult,
It's
right?
very
But
difficult. Yeah.
yeah, but like you said, right, if there's a clear vehicle or a clear bridge where there's this common connection, whether it's through a relationship or whether it's through a related discipline, making that pivot is just that you're making a calculated pivot
Yeah,
versus just a random step outwards or sidestep. So I
exactly.
think that's a really good piece of information because some people tend to struggle with that. Like I want to do something completely different,
Yeah, I
and
think that
it's
that's
it's
right.
tough.
And it's really tough to do something that feels completely out of left field because, you may see the connection. It may make perfect sense to you, but for the hiring managers, for instance, in the new role you want to go to, or, other stakeholders, it just may not make sense. And you really have to help people make sense of things, right? You need to give
Yeah.
them the dots to connect. And that's actually a lot of work I love doing with people, is helping them identify and create those bridges, right? If they're thinking about making a career move, it's all right, how do you take what you have and what you're doing, your unique kind of skills and competencies and connections and all of that? How do you craft that bridge? How do you build that bridge? What is that? And how do you tell that story? I think that's really fun work to do with people.
Yeah. And you've done it yourself, so you can speak
Yeah,
firsthand. Yeah.
exactly.
Going back to the be the buyer, not the seller, and how that has been, important in your career and how that can be important in other people's careers. I think everyone comes to a point where, okay, I have learned what I wanted to learn. I've experienced what I've needed to experience in this particular gig or this particular role. I need to expand, right? There's only so much room for me to grow here, or I've learned what I need to learn here. You know, that comes again back to being the buyer. Okay, well, when do I go and look for something else, right? When do I make an exit? And how is that, how do I make that exit strategically? Um, Curious to hear your thoughts on that because you've done that yourself, and I'm
Mhm.
sure there's other people who want to do that, and it's important to do it well. I think it's really
Yeah.
important to leave well.
Oh, absolutely. Another thing I say all the time is how you leave is as important as how you join, right? How you end is as important as how you start. I think that's really true. And look, it's a different world from, maybe our parents' generation when people joined a company and they really did intend and kind of were expected to stay around for decades, right? That's not the world we live in. And people are being quite intentional, or can be quite intentional, about how they build their careers. And so there's likely to come a time when people will leave their current companies or their current jobs. And I my approach to that is maybe a little different than others. I'm a huge proponent of transparency. And so I think if you're upfront with your manager, with your company, always, right, about what it is that you're looking for, what you can contribute. And by the way, you have to do great work, right? Like the table stakes here is you actually have to deliver. You have to be a really strong employee. But if you can be transparent with people and let them know, like, look, ultimately I aspire to be a chief people officer, right? And here's what I'm currently getting at this company from this experience. This is helping me get there, and here are some gaps, here are some other skills and capabilities and experiences that I want to build and have. How can I get those here? Is it possible? And really work collaboratively with your company to try to find ways to get those experiences. And if you find together, right, that isn't possible, there's going to come a point when maybe that company does not have the ability to offer you what you need to continue to grow towards your desired goal. Then you start having the conversation that, maybe we have to start thinking about an exit strategy here. And again, if you're doing it collaboratively, you're not surprising anyone. You're helping them decide what comes next. You're being really graceful in how you're exiting, and hopefully, continuing to have champions in that organization that are going to support you and advocate for you in your career going forward. So I know some people say, look, if you want to leave, you should just, do a quiet job search. Don't tell your boss. Maybe, right? Maybe there are some cases in companies where that makes sense, but generally speaking, I think if you have a trusting, collaborative relationship with your boss, your company, um, transparency and candor really gets you a long way. And so I encourage people to be very upfront and have those conversations.
Yeah. How many of those conversations, and I don't want you to list any specific names, obviously, but how many of those conversations have you had, or we'll say, your role at TCR Squared as a chief people officer, how many of those conversations have you had as the one who, had a team or, was the chief people officer and had a lot of people going to them with these types of issues? Would you say that that's more common, or you think that's less common?
Oh, I think it's pretty common, but again, I think it's about the company culture and the manager, and there's a whole lot of factors that go into it. I mean, at TCR Squared, we certainly had a culture where we valued development, we valued collaboration and teamwork, but we also valued emotional intelligence. And we did a lot to support that. And so, trying to create a place where employees have that psychological safety, have that support to have, what can feel like difficult conversations sometimes. We certainly strive to create that space for people. And I think we did a really good job of that. And, I will say personally, I get no greater pride than when I see people that I have, personally developed or managed or coached, when I see them moving on and doing, you know, bigger, great things that are their goal, right? Things that they really wanted to do. When I see them accomplishing those things, and I know that maybe I had a little bit of a hand in helping them get there, it's wonderfully gratifying. So, I think for managers, there's a bit of fear, right? When you have employees that maybe tell you that they're thinking of leaving or they don't know if they want to stay, that's scary. But if you can shift from, okay, how can we solve for this together, right? And maybe there's an opportunity to give more experience or more stretch in a role to somebody. Maybe that's, the solution. Or maybe ultimately that employee does have to move on to the next thing. But if you can help them get there and you can work with them to figure out what that plan is so that you're providing continuity to the business, but also support to that individual, and then you see them to go on and do great things, right? Like that's a really proud moment for most managers.
Yeah, I like that. That's rare. Well, I feel like it's rare in business, but I think it should be the norm. And as you were telling me about this, my memory, started going off, and there was somebody who we both know who was a part of the TCR Squared organization, who told me that they were having this type of conversation with you, and I was kind of
Mm.
like taken back by it. And I said, "Well, wow." I'm like, uh, it's fine putting everything out in the open like that." And she said, yeah, it's actually, Angela's working with me, and she's helping me figure out what my next step is, even if it's not with her team. And I was like, okay, that's great to hear. It's not something that you hear all the time. Usually, not usually, but there's other cases where, like you said, that conversation's brought up, and it's like, okay, well, now there's awkwardness. We're
Yeah.
gonna, relegate this person to a different social status within the
Yeah.
company, and all these, like, really
Yeah.
negative things happen. So it was really refreshing, and I would say pretty evolved from you and the leadership team at TCR Squared to take that approach. And I think as humans become more in tune with each other and kind of and their emotions and understanding how each other work and what drives them, this could hopefully be more of a norm within corporations and in small companies. And I would say that you're probably ahead of the curve. And I think biotech in general is ahead of the curve, but you specifically, and the organization that you built was certainly, I think, kind of at the cutting edge of that mentality. That's my opinion, just based because I have a lot of conversations with a lot of individuals, and they don't always have that outlook. And I personally feel, um, without being cheesy or corny, it's a beautiful thing.
Yeah, well, thanks. No, again, I know that it isn't the norm yet. I hope at some point it is a bit, and I wouldn't encourage people to just go out there and tell their manager that they want to quit, right? Like there needs
Of
to be
course.
some groundwork, right? I don't want anyone getting themselves in a difficult situation. But I think the more direct and upfront one can be, always, right? I think it can really end up in some good places. And for managers, I think managers have to recognize that employees aren't going to stay with the company or with you and your team forever. And so if you embrace that and you say, okay, how do I make myself, right, a developer of people? How do I make myself an importer and an exporter of talent and really make that one of my core competencies? Those managers thrive, right? They're the kind of managers everybody wants to work for. They're the managers that every company wants to promote. It's a mindset that I think will serve managers well, and I think it serves employees well to think about being upfront and honest and intentional about their careers.
Yeah, I think what I kind of heard there is as long as, these conversations come with the foundation of progress and productivity within somebody's career journey, then they're okay to be had. If they come from these other places that maybe are not as genuine or maybe a little bit more selfish, they're probably not the best conversations to be had. But if the employee is coming to you with, hey, listen, I want more, I want to grow, I want to be more productive, I want to progress things, then any leader should be open to those conversations because it's not always about that leader. The best leaders,
Yeah.
it's not about them at all. It's about the team they have with them.
Exactly. No, I think I think that's exactly right. And there's, I'll contrast this to just for, to be really clear. What I don't mean here is the employee who just wants a promotion, right?
Yeah,
And who just wants that next title, that next advancement. That's not what I'm talking about. It really is people who are looking for specific development, to have a specific impact, to grow, to stretch, but to deliver, right? It's this constantly wanting to deliver value for organizations, for stakeholders, for clients, for whatever it is. Um, I find it, frankly, it's annoying and frustrating when you have the people who are constantly just wanting that next promotion.
hmm
That's a different story. But I think when it comes from a genuine place of career development and aspiration and impact, then those conversations become really rich and meaningful and frankly really fun to help support.
absolutely. And that's a perfect segue into kind of our next topic, and that's really about kind of you and how one of the things that you and I talked about, a few weeks ago when we met up for lunch was that, you really enjoy empowering other people and really letting people run with things and I'll use the word delegate, right? You like to delegate things, but in a way that is empowering people. And you use the word force multiplier, right? And so you look at your career, you look at some of the things you've done, you look at where you're going next within your career journey, and your ultimate goal, as you've said to me, is really being a force multiplier and being able to exponentially impact people and impact leaders and be a leader yourself, and how that ultimately will help organizations. And then ultimately, if we're talking about the life sciences space, how you can impact patients, right?
Yeah,
This is
yeah,
all connected. It all
absolutely.
it's all connected in such a really, really vast way. Um, so I'm curious to hear about what your kind of vision is there and how you're continuing to improve upon that particular passion that you have within your career.
Oh yeah, thanks, Chris. Yeah, yeah, that's my goal, right? My goal is always, and it always has been, to have increasing impact, ultimately on patients, right? On leaders, on companies, on employees. But for me, working in life sciences, there's always been that North Star of patient impact. And, look, I think being a chief people officer has been absolutely one of the highlights and greatest privileges of my career. It's a role that I love, because you do get to impact so many people and work and organizations, and then therefore ultimately patients. And for me personally, as I think about, what's next, I just want to keep doing that, but I want to keep doing it at a greater scale and to really, again, multiply that impact. As you said, be more of a force multiplier. So for me, I think that means, continuing to do more executive coaching where I'm working with more leaders, to impact their success at more companies, to work, in more of an advisory capacity with CEOs and boards and venture cap or public equity, private equity groups, to help them think about their organizational and talent strategies. But really, dipping my toe in, I guess, into more pots. So being involved in more companies with more leaders so that the impact I can have truly can be multiplied across a portfolio, of companies versus being in house as one chief people officer. Certainly not closing the door on that at some point, right? But
Yeah.
I really want to just broaden that impact.
Yeah, that's great. One of the things we talked about is why you think it's so important to have more HR representation or more people officer representation on boards, because I don't know, maybe until recently it's not something you would see a lot of. Why do you think that is such an important thing going forward? I can see it just based on the last 40 minutes we've been talking, but I'd like you to expand upon that a little bit more.
Yeah, no, I think there's a tremendous opportunity for increasing representation of HR leaders on boards of directors, and I think there's, a few kind of really prominent reasons why. If you think about, for instance, the role of the chief financial officer and how that's so critical to a board, they're always the chair of the audit committee. It's critical, and I don't think anyone would doubt the value and the need for that financial officer perspective. In many ways, I think it's similar, will be similar for the HR officer. The compensation committee is such a critical uh, organization in the governance of any company. And I think having HR officers on boards of directors and running the comp committee will help organizations make sure they have appropriate strategies in place and are measuring and evaluating the impact of decisions they make vis-a-vis comp and ben and diversity, equity, inclusion, all of that, right? So I think that's one kind of obvious reason. The other is really when we think about what's been going on for the last few years here, the challenges that organizations have faced, and just the social, economic, political, cultural, health right challenges that companies have had to deal with. Having somebody who can help shepherd an organization through that, I think, is critical. And to do that at the board level is, to me, probably where it makes a lot of sense. I think certainly the chief people officer, in partnership with the executive team and the board, can do that as well. But not every organization, and certainly not every small startup biotech, is going to have a chief people officer.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think they need a chief people officer necessarily right away, right? There comes a tipping point where you want to bring that level of expertise in house. But I think the boards are a place where you can get that oversight, you can get that expertise, that wisdom, that guidance. And I think it can also just help improve the workings of the board and the management team. So I think there's a lot of opportunity. I know I'm not the first person to talk about this. I think this is gaining some momentum out there, and certainly hope to be part of that future.
That's great. Another part of your future, which is related to this, about being on a board, or having HR representation on a board, is is your experience working with executives and working with entrepreneurs, and for you in your career, how you want to continue to do that. So how do you kind of envision yourself, well, maybe you're participating on boards, uh, but maybe you're also doing some executive coaching as well. I mean, how do you kind of envision that unfolding throughout your career?
Yeah, we'll see, right? I mean, I think this is, I tell people to be intentional, right? And I am, it sounds a little bit like I'm deviating that from a bit. I'm saying we'll see, right? Opportunistic. But for me, the intention really is to impact as many organizations and leaders, and patients as I can. And the way I look to do that, certainly would love to be on a board. I think there's a tremendous opportunity there, working with a venture capital group or a private equity group and helping them think about their portfolio companies and their talent management strategies, I think is another great way to have some of that impact. And then, continuing with the executive coaching, it's really such a pleasure to work with clients and help them fully realize their potential and really embrace their roles, and hopefully even get to that next level and continue to increase and multiply their impact. So I love doing that. And right now it's I'm kind of putting together this little portfolio career for myself where I get to blend a lot of things that I love. And this is also where having that medical affairs background is kind of nice, right? Because being able to talk to a venture capital organization or, a CEO about their growing company and talk to them not just from the people and culture perspective, but from the more scientific, more clinical development perspective, and just knowing what goes into it from a really intimate way, right? Having kind of been there, I think is a nice. It gives me a nice jumping off point for a lot of really interesting conversations with companies.
Yeah, no, I think that's, I'm actually excited for you based on what you've done and kind of where you're looking to go. And I think being on boards and being an executive coach and, being creative and maybe hosting workshops for leaders and executives, as you talked about, I think sounds perfect for all the experience you have, and you're also passionate about it.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad you touched on the workshop thing. That's something, a lot of these roles, right, especially when you get to the executive levels, they're kind of lonely. I mean, they really are, right? You're kind of out there in some ways by yourself. You likely have a great team around you, your fellow C-suite leaders, for instance, and the team that you manage. But there's also a great deal of isolation that goes on, and I think people often think they have to know everything or be the expert, and unless you have a group of people that you can rely on, that you can reach out to, that you can talk to, sometimes it's difficult. And so one of the things I am looking to build, and will likely start this in the fall, are a couple of group coaching workshops. So having some group coaching for instance, chief people officers, maybe even one for aspiring chief people officers, where there's the opportunity not just for that executive coaching, but also for some of that peer coaching and community building. Because I think when you have a cohort of people who have shared interest, passion, complementary skills and experiences and networks, you can just really get tremendous lift from that. And so putting something of that in place, I think, could be really useful for a lot of leaders out there.
Yeah, I mean, that's fantastic. I can actually speak firsthand to that, right? Like, I think some of the most productive times in my career is when I had a lot of really strong peers around me, and also had some really safe leaders that I could speak to, that helped kind of elevate me. And then, going into what I've been doing over the last couple of years, starting my own practice, there is an element of loneliness, right?
Mhm.
Like, I don't have as many people to bounce ideas off of as I previously had, and that's fine, and it's temporary. But I can, when you said that certain entrepreneurs or executives can get lonely because there's a level of isolation, it's a real thing. It's totally a real thing, and
Mhm.
so I think there's a huge opportunity there for individuals like yourself who are aware of that and who are putting on workshops and are on boards and are interested in executive coaching. There's an opportunity because there's an appetite for, right?
Mhm.
Executives and leaders need to have an outlet, and other individuals to bounce ideas off of. So I love that that's something that you're very conscious of, and that it's something that you're going to pursue, because I think it's an evolved way of thinking about business and productivity.
Oh, thank you. I'm glad to hear that. Yeah,
Yeah.
I think, look, what is it, all boats rise, right? The more we can help one another and lift one another up, the better it is for our communities, for our employees, for the people around us, and, again, in our space in healthcare life sciences, for patients. So the more we can do to lift one another up and help provide that community, I think it's important work.
Well, that is a perfect way to conclude this conversation, Angela. It's been an honor having you. It's been really fun, and I learned a lot about you over the last hour or so. So thank you so much for joining.
Thank you, Chris. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Talent Therapy Podcast with Chris Tamburini. This show is for entertainment purposes only and is copywritten by Rana and Vance, LLC.